everybody. I'm here with James O'Dwyer, and we are hosting this series on the history of modeling and theory as part of the SMTPB. That's the Society for Modeling and Theory in Population Biology. And our goals here really are to bring voices that have really shaped our field and record their perspectives on how their fields have changed, any advice they have for students and young theoreticians. And we hope you'll join us in this series as well as with SMTPB. So I'm also want to thank Kaylee Charlebois, a student at UBC who has been the technical wizard behind the scenes. Thank you, Kaylee. James, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Sally. Pleasure to be here again. I'm excited for our interview today. I'm going to be meeting with Joel Cohen. Joel is the Abby Rockefeller Mauzé Professor of Populations at Rockefeller University. He also has a number of other visiting appointments at different schools, including Columbia and also University of Chicago. Just to briefly give you some of his background, he did his undergrad work in applied mathematics. That was at Harvard University. He stayed there for a collection of graduate degrees, so 2 master's degrees and 2 PhDs, which is a significant fraction of the way towards the incredible Hulk's 7 PhDs. Those were completed in the early 1970s, one in applied mathematics again, and also in population sciences and tropical public health. So quite a broad range of expertise garnered during his training. Joel was then a faculty member also at Harvard before fairly quickly moving to the Rockefeller University in the mid-1970s, where he has been ever since. Sally, he's also been honored with a number of awards over the years.
The MacArthur Fellowship, that's right, and the Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, among others.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that reflects his work. And so we'll be talking about that during our interview today. But just to give a brief sense of that, Joel's work in populations and ecology and quantitative biology is extremely broad. To pick out a couple of highlight things that have been influential to me, things I've enjoyed reading, he's had extremely influential papers on the structure of food webs. So that's been an area which has definitely influenced my work.
And just reflecting on that a little bit, I think he took kind of food webs as this just a picture that one would draw about all the interactions and made it into a mathematical object. It's a network. How do we describe that network? How do we describe the trophic levels in kind of more of a mathematical structure?
Right, exactly. Other areas that Joel has had a big influence on, invasive populations, a number of classic papers in that area. Also something which I always find stimulating for discussion. Joel's thought a lot about the future of the human population. And some of his work comes up often in teaching my ecology class, for example.
Right, and not just the growth of the human population, but how do we model the carrying capacity of the Earth as human population grows, that kind of thing.
Right. One study I know from Joel gathered together a number of other studies on people trying to estimate that and how difficult it is. And just to give you the range, there are several estimates out there which are significantly less than the current human population. Also, some going up into, I think, the hundreds of billions or even a trillion. So I think one of his conclusions was that it's extremely hard to quantify and estimate that. One last thing, Sally, on a personal note, when I was first starting out in quantitative biology and thinking about working in ecology, I emailed Joel, and I didn't know him, but I asked him, asked his advice, and so he was encouraging, and that was helpful to hear. And he told me an interesting story about Planck deciding whether to work in physics or economics at the turn of the 19th to 20th century. And Planck chose physics apparently because economics was considered too hard. And Joel said then he believes that ecology is hard in the same sense that economics is hard, in that many of the fundamental laws are not yet known, or those that are quote unquote known are wrong. So I'm interested to hear today if he still thinks that.
Indeed. I'm looking forward to this. Welcome, Joel, to this series. It's so great to have you here with us today.
Thank you for inviting me to be part of it. I'm delighted to be here.
Over to you, James.
Super. Okay, well, I'm going to launch into our first question, Joel, if you're ready.
Yes, sir.
We're wondering, when did you first realize that math was a tool that could be used to provide insights into biology?
I went into a university library reading room. I think it was University of Michigan, because I was living in Battle Creek, Michigan at that time. And I remember sitting down at a table waiting for my composition lesson. I thought I was going to be a composer. And there was a book, a thick book on the table, and it was the Journal of General Physiology from sometime in the 30s. And I opened it at random, and there was an article on the response of the earthworm to light of varying intensity, of different constant levels of intensity. And the article showed that the attraction, the positive phototropism of the earthworm to light of different levels of intensity obeyed the Weber-Fechner psychophysical law, which was discovered in the 19th century. And it is a law of constant increment relative to background intensity, which leads to a logarithmic shaped response. As the intensity goes up, the amount that the earthworm turns its head toward the light goes up as the logarithm of the intensity. And this blew me away because I had just learned myself what the logarithm was. So I must have been either in junior high school or high school, but I think junior high school. I had just learned what logarithms are, and it had taken me a lot of work to understand what a logarithm is. And here, these earthworms were computing the logarithm. And I said, wow, mathematics is the language of biology. And that had a huge impact.
That's great. That's actually really early. A lot of people find math very late and don't quite see the connection, but that's great that you learned it early. Were there people that guided you along the way or that influenced you and helped you early in your career?
Well, as I said, I was living in Battle Creek, Michigan, and Battle Creek at that time had one bookstore, the Read More newsstand. And I used to frequent the Read More newsstand. And I came across a box of books on the floor marked down Dover reprints. They had been marked down because nobody was buying them. And one of the books in this box was Alfred J. Lotka's Elements of Physical Biology. Actually, that's the name of the original publication, but the Dover reprint is called Elements of Mathematical Biology. And I picked it up and I got very excited. And the price was 50 cents. And I was not accustomed to walking around with such large amounts of cash. So I asked the store owner if he would hold it for me. And I ran home, acquired 50 cents, and ran back and bought the book. I still have that book. And moreover, one of my treasures is a first edition, the original Elements of Physical Biology by Lotka. So I have the paperback Dover and the original. And that book told me that I'm not the only crazy person in the world. Here is somebody else who thinks that mathematics can help understand complicated biological questions. And I have a clipping from the Battle Creek Enquirer and News, which was the local newspaper, which for some reason was about me. I had won some prize or something. And I was 14 years old, and I was considering becoming, it says in print, I was considering either a composer or a mathematical biologist. So it was a confluence of this accident in the reading room and Lotka's book that had a tremendous influence. There were a couple of other books that were influential. I came across Nicholas Rashevsky, again, Dover reprints. Thank God for Dover publications. They make books available to people. And I read quite a bit of Rashevsky. It wasn't the kind of mathematical biology that I wanted to do. It was too remote from empirical problems. Another book, but it was influential. It showed me that, again, this is a possible approach to biology. Another book that had a huge influence on me was Larry Slobodkin's introduction. I don't remember the title of the book, but it was a textbook. In my junior year in college, I took Ed Wilson's ecology evolution course. And one of the textbooks was Larry Slobodkin's textbook. And in there was the statement that the growth rate of a stage-structured population is given by the largest eigenvalue of the projection matrix. And I didn't know what an eigenvalue was. I had no clue. I didn't know what a matrix was. And I decided I'd better find out. And it motivated me to start learning linear algebra. I was a math major, but I can tell you a story about that. But I didn't know beans about elementary linear algebra. And Slobodkin's book said, there's a good reason to know what linear algebra, because it tells you something about populations. So that moved me into the area of stage and age structured populations. So who were the people who inspired me early in my career? The writers of books, Lotka, Rashevsky, Bodkin.
Joel, just one more follow-up on that question. I'm kind of interested, maybe a bit like Sally. By the time you got to college, you knew you wanted to do mathematical biology, which I think still can be somewhat unusual. And did you find there were two worlds? You had the world of your math major, and then you had the ecology classes you might have been taking on the side, or did they kind of come together already at that point?
Thank you for that question. I went into the biology undergraduate. I arrived as a freshman. I went to the biology undergraduate and I said, I want to do biology and mathematics. And the gentleman I spoke with said, I'm sorry, we don't do mathematics. Go to the math department. And I went to the math department. I said I wanted to do biology and mathematics. And the math department gentlemen, these were all men, of course. The math department gentleman said, sorry, we don't do biology. Go to the biology department. So I looked at the requirements for both fields. How many courses did I have to take in order to major in one or the other? And since mathematics had fewer requirements than biology, I signed up for mathematics with the resolve, which I carried out, to take biology courses when not satisfying the requirements for biology, for mathematics. So you're exactly right. The institution was completely hostile to the notion of an interaction between biology and mathematics at that entrance level. Nowadays, that same institution has an applied math major jointly with biology. So there has been tremendous change. This anticipates something you may come to later, but there's been big change in the way people think about how to do good biology. And I'm grateful for that change.
Does that explain your 2 masters and your 2 PhDs? Is that you basically needed to get both? And
Yeah, that's exactly right. I went in, by the time I went to college, I went in with the intention of doing a PhD in mathematics and an MD. But after I finished college, I got a fellowship from Harvard, it was, to travel around the world by myself for 14 months. And the first place I went was to the tropical ecology course in Costa Rica for 2 months of field work with Dan Jansen and lots of other really good, Jose Sarucan and other good ecologists and fellow ecologist students. 2 months in the field, living under field conditions in small villages, and then Japan, traveling all across India, East Africa, Israel, Germany, France, England, Institute of Animal Physiology in England. 14 months of travel at 10 major institutions for 2 months, roughly 2 months each, and then short stuff. And I saw that most of the world was too poor to be taken care of by medicine. And that diverted me from medicine to public health and prevention of it, understanding the environmental context of disease and health, and wanting to get the interaction between people and the environment so that it takes care of the people and the environment. But I had the intent of 2 PhDs because there was no available training where you could do it with one. So I did eventually get a PhD in applied math and a doctor of public health, tropical infectious diseases, and population sciences.
Yeah, interesting. And I think some of this might come up later on as to how things have changed, which they have, and maybe other things that haven't. And it'll be interesting to hear your thoughts on that. I'm going to jump ahead. Probably, I think it's going to be to somewhere later in your career. So it's about the process of discovery. So we're wondering if you have a favorite example of an aha moment where something quantitative, a model, or something of that nature helped you figure out something that had puzzled you before. And maybe it's going to go back to the earthworm, or it could be something later on. I don't know. So is there an example of an aha moment that you'd like to share with us, Joel?
Well, how many weeks have you got? But there, one example is from my work on food webs. I collected a bunch of food webs from the literature and did a plot of horizontal axis, number of species or nodes in the food web, horizontal axis, vertical axis, number of trophic links. That is, if you represent the food web as a bunch of points representing species and arrows if energy flows from A to B, count how many arrows there are and count how many dots there are. So horizontal axis, number of nodes, number of species, vertical axis, number of links, number of trophic connections. And found and published in Nature in 1977 or 8, something like that, a linear relationship. and I didn't have a model of that, but it was crying out for one.
Mm-hmm.
And then there were other features of this collection, that there was pretty much a fixed fraction of basal species, plants that aren't eating anybody, intermediate species, herbivores, and carnivores. So basal, intermediate, and top species, these proportions were pretty steady over the range from small food webs to large food webs. And these were empirical findings for which I had no explanation until after experimentation with models that didn't work, I came to a model which I analyzed jointly with my colleague Charles Newman of the Courant Institute, a model which we called the Cascade model, in a series of 6 papers, the first 4 of which were in the Proceedings of the Royal Society. And it was really happy-making to do calculations from this model and find that it predicted the linear relationship, it predicted the basal, intermediate, top, and it predicted a whole bunch of other things which are in the papers. So that was a happy moment for me. I remember that very, very clearly.
That's thrilling. Do you have a favorite paper of yours that you wish were, that's a very famous paper. Do you have a paper that you wish was better known?
I have 3 candidates. Not to be greedy, but I'll try to be.
Well, we can put links to all 3 of them on the podcast.
I can send you the links. I mean, I can say all 3 of these reprints are available for free on my website, so I'd be perfectly happy. And they share a common problem, which I'll tell you about at the end, which may have something to do with why they're not very widely known. So the first one, 1984, jointly with Charles Newman at Courant Institute. And it's called The Stability of Large Random Matrices and Their Products. So I read Bob May's paper in Nature on large random matrices. And he has a footnote about the Wigner's semicircle law, and he says that proves his theorem. Well, I'm not a physicist. I didn't know the Wigner semicircle law. I take it on faith. And then Harold Hastings published in the Journal of Theoretical Biology a proof. So I said, okay, I'm not smart enough to figure out the proof, but I can at least follow the proof. And I went through the proof and I couldn't get at a certain point from one point to the next. I couldn't do it. So Newman is smarter than I am. I say, Chuck, what's going on here? Tell me how to get from A to B. He comes back and says, you can't get from A to B. It's wrong. And then we go back. So the proof is not a proof. Then we go back to the claims in May's Nature paper, 1973. And the claims are true sometimes, but they're false sometimes. And Newman constructed counterexamples where the claimed relationship between diversity and complexity in food webs that May made doesn't work. And we wrote a paper, and I sent it by letter to Bob May before publication. And the letter that came back was incoherent. I still have it, but I've never published it. So we published this paper in Annals of Probability, which is the top, stiffest journal in probability theory. which is a validation of the correctness of our results, but an obstacle to readership by biologists because it is a math paper. And this is a recurrent problem of mine. Some of the best results that I've gotten can't be read by most biologists because their mathematical training just doesn't prepare them for that kind of heavy slogging. So that is a problem. However, I consider this to be an important paper, and I think a lot of obeisance, kowtowing to May's so-called theorem is a mistake. And I wish this paper were better known. We published an informal summary in the Journal of Theoretical Biology in 1985, but that's not convincing if you haven't gone through the proofs and the counterexamples. That's one example.
And I think our viewers will be interested to check out that paper. So we really should get the link to it up there just so people can check it out easily.
Both of them, the JT.
I'll give you both. Yeah. I'll give you both the Annals of Probability and Journal of Theoretical Biology. The second one, I got interested in Taylor's law. Mm-hmm. Thanks to Michael Hochberg at the University of Montpellier in France. I went and spent a summer with him, and he says to me, "What do you think about Taylor's law?" And I say to him, "What's Taylor's law? I had never heard of it. I didn't know anything about it." So he educated me, and we collaborated in some empirical work and an empirical demonstration of Taylor's law. I credit him with opening doors for me intellectually. I thank you, Michael. And I thought about the mathematics of Taylor's law, and I was invited to give a talk at Columbia University in the statistics department. And I asked a question in that talk, and this was around 2014 or so. Mm-hmm. I said, what happens if your samples come not from a distribution with a finite mean and variance, but from distributions that have infinite mean and infinite variance? Now, 99% of all statistics courses don't talk about that world of distributions with infinite means and variances.
Right.
Because scientifically, the whole field was founded roughly 1924, so it's 101 years old. Then it was even 10 years ago, 2014, it was less than 100 years old. The word had not percolated into biology, but the phenomena have percolated into biology of infinite means and infinite variances. And I can explain what that means if you want. So I gave my talk, and 2 years later, two of the guys who had been in the audience said, "We have an answer to your question about Taylor's law for distributions with infinite means and variances." And they proved, and I helped a little bit, but they proved. So it's Mark Brown and Victor de la Peña of the statistics department at Columbia proved that you can get a Taylor's law even from distributions that have infinite means and variances, because the sample mean, your observations, and the sample variance are always finite. And the question is, how do they scale together? As the sample mean moves off to infinity, it turns out that the sample variance behaves in a very regular way, which is given exactly by Taylor's law. So that opened up a whole area, mostly unknown even now to the biologists, because it requires mathematical equipment that is not a part of any standard probability or statistics course. This is new stuff. So that paper in Journal of Applied Probability in 2017, I consider to be opening of a new area of research. And the total number of citations, other than papers by me, is about a handful, 5 or 6 papers. And I'll give you one more example, and then I'll let up on this. In 2020, I published a paper in Theoretical Ecology. Thank you, Alan Hastings.
Mhm.
The paper is called Every Variance Function, including Taylor's power law of fluctuation scaling, can be produced by any location scale family of distributions with positive mean and variance. How do you like that for a short, catchy title?
You've got to think about it. You've got to think about that title to know what you're going to read.
Well, the title is almost as long as the paper. So what's the point here? The point is there are lots of models that lead to Taylor's law. But seeing that Taylor's law holds gives you no information about the distributions that compose the means and the variances that you're relating in Taylor's law. So it's informative to go from a specific model to Taylor's law to see if it has that property, but you can't make the reverse without looking into the details. And that's the point.
Joel, I have to go back a little bit because this isn't very familiar to me, but Taylor's law is basically saying for an empiricist, if you're going out there and you're measuring the mean, say, population density, and you want to relate that to the variance and say something about the generating function, what you're telling us is that that's hard to do.
Yes. So you have a set of conditions. Let's say we should have, 10 or more. And you measure the mean and variance of some quantity in each of those conditions, So then you get two numbers out of those observations, the mean and the variance, sample mean and variance. For example, population density in Chicago, population density of moths in Boston, population density in New York, each place, okay? And you look at the mean and variance. You might do it over time or some mean and variance. Or in different samples, you put out your traps and you count how many you get on Tuesday. And then you plot the log of the mean and the log of the variance. And if you get a straight line, that's Taylor's law.
So powers. And what you're saying is that's true even if the mean and the variance of the generating distribution is infinite.
Yes, and you can't tell from the slope what's going on in the individual measurements. Okay, so the paper that I mentioned about infinite means and variances, the real underlying distribution may have infinite mean and variance. Your samples will, of course, have finite mean and variance. But the point is the reverse inference cannot be made.
Unidentified.
Which is not what Taylor himself says in his 1961 paper. He says in Nature, 1961, that you can infer the clusteredness of your observations from whether the slope, if it's is 1 or 2 or more or less, where does it fall? That tells you, are the organisms aggregating? And I'm saying, no, you can't make that inference. You can get any shaped relationship between the log mean and the log variance that you want from any distribution by adjusting the parameters of the mean and the parameters of the distribution appropriately. Well, it's a short paper, and unfortunately, I made some mathematical mistakes. The theorems are correct, but I screwed up the notation in one of the proofs, and somebody pointed it out to me. By jumbo, I was wrong. I made a mistake. The claim that I was trying to prove remains true, but I got the proof wrong. So we published a correction. Well, the correction had a mistake. So another guy wrote to me and said, hey, look, you screwed up again. I said, oh, You're right. So this time you published the correction, and let's get it right on the second try. So this is it's hard to read this paper because it's making an abstract point about what kind of inference is possible from seeing a Taylor's law. Basically, very little. What you can say is, if you get this shape, probably it's not coming from a Poisson distribution. That kind of thing you can say. Anyway, so I wish that paper were more widely read. I wish I had gotten the details of the proof right. The statement, the claims are right, but hey, what do you know? You do your best.
Well,
Okay, that's a
I appreciate,
long.
first of all, I really appreciate you admitting you got it wrong. We all get things wrong, but people often fail to admit it, or even to recognize that it's a normal part of science, and just owning it and saying, "Oh, let's correct it and move on."
Yeah. Well, a lot of people have made mistakes, I'm included, such as life.
Such as life.
The other thing about that example is, I think it's I'm probably not going to be very precise about this, but I think many of the quantitative biologists who might be watching this have a sense of that phenomenon of the map from mechanism or process to fairly low dimensional patterns is many to one. But it's really nice to make that precise in a particular context with a particular pattern, and then still, like you said, be able to say something, even if it's not as much as what you originally thought, or Taylor maybe originally thought you could say. So I think that's a really neat example.
Mm-hmm. I think
that is exactly right. Exactly right, James.
I keep interrupting. Sorry. You were saying that those three examples tied together, and I think they tied together in that you really want their audience to be biologists, but biologists don't have the training to be able to read them. Is that correct?
That's exactly the point I should have said. Yes, thank you. That's right.
So do you have advice for students entering the field? And I think we're talking about the field that you started in, which is between math and biology. What would you recommend?
I would recommend, for one thing, reading a paper by Hal Caswell, who is another collaborator and colleague, highly respected colleague, productive, imaginative, persistent, a very good scientist. Hal Caswell, 1988, Theory and Models in Ecology, A Different Perspective, Ecological Modeling, Volume 43. I recommend that paper. I think it is a good discussion of a question that can be very confusing, because people use models and theory in different ways. Theory sometimes is verbal, theory sometimes means mathematical. So I'm not going to try to recapitulate what he says. I think he says it better than I could recapitulate it, but I would recommend reading that. Having read that article, I think, students should learn as much mathematics as they can and should do biology firsthand, not remotely. But if it's field ecology, go to the field, do observation, make observations, understand how data are generated. If it's lab stuff, do experiments and find out how difficult it is to get meaningful results.
Right.
And do both, and then be prepared to be ignorant and learning your whole life, because it's a constant process of expanding your understanding both of the biology and of the mathematics. You can never be fully prepared. I am still struggling to learn new stuff, and I think that's part of the thrill of the hunt, is just not knowing enough, but trying to make some progress. And I hope that our country comes to its senses in supporting long-term basic research, which I think will prove to be one of our best investments.
Well said. I have a question which is maybe the other side of this question about the advice to new people coming into the field, but it's related to the comments about your paper. So we're wondering how you think the perception of modeling in ecology or in your areas of research within quantitative biology, how has that changed since you started?
Well, I think it's probably obvious to you and to me that there's much more recognition of the importance of quantitative modeling. I mean, at every level of complexity in biology, starting from the molecular to the astrobiological, people are doing modeling. And particularly in the areas that I'm interested in, public health and infectious diseases, the models have been important for the foot and mouth disease in UK and for COVID planning in the US. It's now an accepted thing that having a biomathematics group makes sense. Is that sufficient response?
Probably been, yeah, I think so. And I think the perception is different, and it's but the challenges are maybe there that you mentioned earlier about everyone in a collaboration being able to speak enough of a common language for those collaborations to be successful. That still remains something that's challenging sometimes.
I absolutely agree. And that requires patience and self-education, as well as trying to, encourage and educate your collaborators. But it's fun. It's fun to try to speak across language barriers. It's fun. I recommend, yeah.
Well, and also I'm reflecting on your humility in saying that you read a serious proof and you could follow it. You couldn't have done it. You could follow it. And just recognizing that whatever level at which you're able to read, you go in there, do it. You'll get better. But it's okay not to be an expert right away.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if you're lucky, as I have been in many times, collaborate with people who are better, who are smarter, who have something to teach you. I've learned a lot from my collaborators. It's been a great privilege.
We have a couple more questions. Sally, you okay if I ask two in a row?
Sure.
Is that okay with you?
Sure.
All right. Okay. So this question, just thinking about your work and how I would think about your work, and also how it's described on your website and so on. Population biology is your field,
right?
But you've applied that idea of population across a broad range of examples, maybe places where people wouldn't have even recognized, oh, that's a population. And so do you feel kind of comfortable with populations being a kind of unifying principle? Have populations taken you further than you expected? Is it a lens through which you view the world very generally?
Well, a population is any ensemble that has properties you're interested in, and the units in that ensemble may or may not be living. So the population of taxicabs, the 30,000 taxicabs on the streets of New York or whatever it is, that's a population. The light bulbs in my house are a population. They have a mean length of life and a variance of length of life. And I'm interested in those properties. As you and I are speaking, look over the top of my computer screen, and a turkey has just emerged from the forest and is pecking around for something to eat. The ensemble of turkeys in my backyard is another population. the quantitative study of biology, well, you could go back to Fibonacci in the 13th, 12th century, his model of rabbits reproducing. But the modern study really goes back to Euler in the 18th century, Leonhard Euler, the Swiss mathematician. And so our whole field is less than 500 years old. We are still in the process of inventing the concepts that we need to understand populations and biology generally. And I see our subject as in its maybe beyond infancy, but early childhood. And I think there will be maturation, there will be new concepts that come along that include the concept of population. But I don't know what those will be, but I think we should push the concept of population as far as we can make it go usefully. And at the boundaries there, we'll encounter new concepts that we need for the next steps. The analysis, there are huge quantities of genetic data being generated for all and molecular data. We don't have really a good handle on those. And our tools for those are inadequate. Our tools for understanding the macroscopic biological world are inadequate, even for measuring it, let alone for understanding it. So, the idea of a population is a unifying idea across fields, but I wouldn't go so far as to say it's the only one. And I don't know what comes next or where it goes, but by pushing the boundaries, I hope we can encounter what comes next.
That is all we can ever hope to do as scientists, is push those boundaries of knowledge a little bit further on. So you said you didn't know what comes next, but I'd be curious to know as we end what you see as the kind of teenage years of our field in terms of what tools will be used. There's so much new development in machine learning and predictive methods. Do you see that as exciting, or do you see other areas as really opening up new tools for the next generation?
I think these advances in machine learning and artificial intelligence, large language models, all of these, a certain fraction of this apparent progress is advertising buzzwords. A lot of large language models are simply regression models, statistical regression models. And that's great. And if it attracts resources into the field, that's great. But the capabilities of scaling up regression from one I can do by hand to something that requires a month of supercomputing, the consequences of that change at scale are phenomenal. And I love the capacity to generate hypotheses. I take the output of a AI program as a hypothesis, not as a fact. And then one has to go back and verify. And what's important is understanding. The purpose here is to gain understanding, perhaps control, but without understanding, I don't think, we're nowhere. So I think that the mentality of Euler from the 18th century will permanently remain valuable. Simple models where you can analyze the whole thing and understand it down to the last stone. That's valuable. And what we need is the development of understanding for the large language models for the AI, so that we can have some assurance that this makes sense. Does it make sense? That's the question I would keep asking. But I'm sure the tools will change, and that's great. Already these tools have given me capacities that I wouldn't have had otherwise. So I'm very grateful for the progress. But let's understand what's going on.
And that's a really important message. And I agree. There's nothing like a model, both first to teach what you're confused about, because the model's like, that's not going to work. But then to eventually, when you've got it nailed down, to really solidify your understanding. And so this kind of bridging of we still want that at core as modelers, bridging that to all of the new tools in machine learning and AI. It's good advice. Any other questions from you, James?
I think at the end of my questions, there's some fantastic answers there from Joel. So I'm excited to see what people make of the interview.
Any last words, Joel?
I want to thank you for doing this series. I want to thank you for the honor of being included in your series. And you are making a very valuable contribution to the next generation of researchers who will be smarter than I am and smarter than we all are. And I wish them the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel.
Thanks, Joel.